In 1994, Tanya Frazier lived in the Mount Baker neighborhood in southeast Seattle with her mother and sister. The 14-year-old tomboy was sweet and generous, always bringing joy to those around her. Despite her slightly shy disposition, she was an altar server at St. Clement's Episcopal Church and spent the day of July 17th at a church picnic. She participated in potato sack races and told fellow parishioners about her new haircut. The following day, Monday, July 18th, 1994, Tanya had summer classes at Meany Middle School in the morning. She was last seen leaving the school around 11 a.m. As expected, she was then supposed to take the bus to get to her part-time job at a thrift store on Jackson Street run by the Chicken Soup Brigade, a local nonprofit. Tanya did not arrive home at 6 p.m. as expected, so her mother Teresa went to the thrift store to look for her. She learned that Tanya had never arrived for her scheduled shift. Teresa then went to Meany Middle School to look for Tanya, but there was no sign of her there. Teresa contacted the police to report Tanya missing around 7:30 p.m. Police did not seem to view Tanya's disappearance as an urgent matter. They repeatedly tried to get her younger sister to say that Tanya had plans to run away from home and referred to Tanya as a runaway throughout their initial report. This was an important distinction because while a missing child would have a detective assigned to their case, a runaway would only be assigned a community service officer. An officer spoke to two of Tanya's friends and called Teresa a few days later to ask if she had heard from Tanya. Tanya's mother did not believe her daughter had run away, both because it would have been out of character for her and because of practical considerations. If Tanya had left on her own accord, she had done so without any of her belongings or any money. At the time she disappeared, Tanya was excitedly waiting for her first paycheck from her part-time job, which she was due to receive in just a few days. She planned to use the money to buy pagers for herself and for her 12-year-old sister Tyra. Tyra herself was another reason why no one who knew Tanya believed she had run away. Tyra and Tanya were very close and were described as soulmates. Tanya would almost certainly never have gone anywhere without Tyra and would have at least talked to her if she had any plans to leave. Tyra spent the night after Tanya disappeared with her bedroom window open just in case Tanya came home. While she could not imagine Tanya running away, the idea of something bad happening to Tanya was even more difficult to fathom. Tanya's church quickly came together to organize on Tanya's behalf when she disappeared. Corporate policies prevented them from posting flyers in many stores, but they still covered the area in over 1,500 missing persons posters. The police have a hell of a task. I want to be supportive of that, Father Ralph Garcadden, Tanya's pastor, told the media. But I also feel that had Tanya not come from our neighborhood or not been mixed race, would more people have known this terrible thing had happened to her. On July 23, 1994, 5 days after Tanya went missing, a 62-year-old man was walking his dog along East Highland Drive when he noticed the smell of death. He had become familiar with that smell during his time serving during the Korean War. He stepped into a wooded area along the street and saw someone lying at the base of a tree at the bottom of a ravine. He stared at the person for several seconds before he fully processed the fact that he was looking at a human body. The body belonged to Tanya Frazier, who had been stabbed to death. The medical examiner believed she had not been killed until July 20th, 2 days after her disappearance. This caused fear in Tanya's mother Teresa that the police initially dismissing her daughter as a runaway may have resulted in her death. From the first report, I often wondered if they took it as more serious. If they looked in that first 24 hours, would there have been a chance she maybe would have been saved? That's a big question, she later told the Seattle Times. Tanya's community came together to mourn her loss. A memorial was established near where her body was found, and members of her church took to the streets for walks of remembrance. It was a member of her church who donated the cemetery plot where Tanya would be buried. Tanya had a routine of picking out one of her stuffed animals to take with her on her walk to school every day. Other students now took up this habit. Tanya was last seen alive at 21st Avenue and East Thomas Street, approximately 11 blocks away from where her body would later be found. Her friends reported seeing her speaking to an unfamiliar, unkempt man. This man has so far never been identified, despite the best efforts of her loved ones. Tanya's case received little media attention. Talking about her daughter's murder was unbearable for Teresa, but she tried to find any opportunity to do so that she could in order to keep the case in the news and hopefully reach a witness who could help solve the case. Flyers posted by Crime Stoppers generated just 3 calls to the tip line, none of which helped advance the investigation. Private investigator Rose Windquist began working with Tanya's family the week she went missing. She continues to work on the case and forwards every credible lead she finds to the police. Seattle Police Detective Ralph Norton, who has been the lead investigator on Tanya's case since June of 2016, says that there are numerous persons of interest in the case, none of whom will be cleared until the case is definitively solved. Despite the fact that almost 30 years have passed since Tanya's murder, her sister Tyra is still hoping that one day the case will be solved. "I am hopeful. I can't imagine this just never being solved and never having that closure, so I'm hopeful that it will be," she said in 2023. 2009 started out as a normal day for Robert and Janice Che. Around 5 a.m., they were preparing to leave for work. The couple owned Penn Station Beauty Supply, a beauty supply store located in Suburban Station, a major train station in central Philadelphia. The business was very successful, which had allowed them to buy their 4-bedroom home in the town of North Wales, in Montgomery County, north of Philadelphia. They drove into the city each day to operate their business. They did not get to leave, as was their routine on this day. However, Janice was in their garage putting on her shoes, and Robert was in the driveway on his way to warm up his vehicle, when they were ambushed by 3 armed men. The attackers dragged Robert into the garage, as he asked why they were doing this and tried to fight them off. The 3 men then began beating him and binding him with duct tape and flex ties. Janice was then forced inside the home by 2 of the unknown men. She was taken upstairs, where the attackers forced her to help them get into the safe in her bedroom. They stole between $15,000 and $20,000 in cash, some gold jewelry, a passbook for a Korean bank account, and a family symbol stamp. The Che's 2 adult children also lived in the house but had been asleep when the attack started. 23-year-old Mina awoke to the sound of her mother hyperventilating in the hallway and got up to check on her. One of the attackers put a gun to her head and demanded access to the safe. As her mother had not yet provided it, when Mina said she did not know how to open the safe, she was taken to the garage and forced to kneel on the floor next to her severely injured father. 29-year-old Richard was awoken by the attackers coming into his bedroom and shining flashlights in his face. They pistol whipped him, and he fell to the floor before being dragged from the room. Janice, Mina, and Richard were all taken to the basement and bound with duct tape. One of the attackers stayed in the basement to guard them, but he then went upstairs. As soon as she and her children were alone, Janice was able to free herself enough from the duct tape to run out of the house through a door in the basement. She ran to a neighbor's house to call 911. When the attackers realized that Janice had escaped and had most likely gone for help, they immediately fled. Richard was able to free himself and his sister, and ran upstairs to lock the door to prevent the man from coming back inside the home. Richard and Mina then went to their father in the garage. Duct tape had been used to bind his feet together and his arms behind his back. Robert's head was also almost completely covered with duct tape. By the time police arrived on the scene, Robert was dead. He was 58 years old. His autopsy found that he had died as the result of asphyxia. The duct tape covering his head restricted his airway, and due to the severe beating he was subjected to, he bled extensively, and his blood went into his airway. Robert was born Jean in a small village in Korea in 1950. He grew up very poor and was only able to leave his village by joining the military. When he first came to the United States, he had only a few $100s with him and no English language skills. Despite these circumstances, he got married, had a family, and started his successful business. When he became a naturalized U.S. citizen, he changed his first name to the more American-sounding Robert. There had been a string of home invasion robberies targeting Asian business owners in Philadelphia, so the possibility that Robert's murder had been connected to these crimes was considered. However, the victim profile appeared to be the only thing in common between the attack on the Che family and the other robberies. In those crimes, the victim was accosted by armed perpetrators who quickly took money and valuables and left. None of these other robbery victims or their families were restrained or assaulted. Furthermore, The perpetrators in these crimes wore ski masks to prevent their victims from being able to identify them. The fact that the individuals who attacked the Che family and killed Robert had not worn masks raised concerns that they had not been worried about the Chis being able to later identify them. They may not have worn masks because they planned to kill all the members of the family to eliminate any witnesses, a plan that was ruined by Janice Che's escape. Richard J. had poor eyesight and relied on glasses to see clearly. Since he obviously did not sleep with them on, he could not clearly see the individuals who pulled him from his bed and forced him into the basement. Mina and Janice, however, were able to provide detailed descriptions of two of the men who had invaded their home. They worked with a sketch artist to develop composite images of the men, which were then released to the local media. Because Janice and Mina could potentially identify the men who attacked them and killed Robert, police feared that the men may return to kill them to prevent them from ever making such an identification. The Chis did not feel safe in their home because they shared such fears and found it difficult to be in the place where they had been attacked and Robert had been murdered. They, therefore, went to stay with family, and police kept them under surveillance there for their safety. While only 3 men had forced their way into the Che home, more people may have been involved. According to the surviving members of the Che family, the 3 attackers inside the home had been talking on cell phones. The conversations the Chis overheard indicated that the people on the other end of the line were also involved in the crime. Cell phone data would prove to be critical to the investigation. Police obtained a subpoena, which allowed them to access the records of the cell phone tower located closest to the Che home, in order to see what calls were being made in the area at the time of the home invasion. They were able to identify at least 3 phones that had been in contact with each other in the area at the time in question. Unfortunately, they were all prepaid cell phones, meaning there was no account owner on record for any of them. However, investigators were able to identify other numbers each of these phones had been calling. In analyzing these records, they came across calls made to someone close to the case, Angelo Shin. Shin was the nephew of Robert Che. While he was in high school, Shin had lived with the Chis for a year and a half while his parents had been in Korea, meaning he was familiar with the layout of the Che house and aware of the location of their safe. Robert and Janice treated Shin as though he were their own son, and their son Richard considered Shin to be a brother. Shin had a minor criminal record, 1 drug arrest, and would later be labeled by prosecutors as a wannabe gangster. Police were surprised that a member of the Che's own family could have been involved in the attack on them that resulted in Robert's death. The possibility was also concerning because it meant the surviving members of the family were potentially in serious danger. They had been staying with Shin and his family since the murder, meaning he had easy access to them should he and his accomplices decide to kill them to prevent them from identifying the men who had invaded their home and killed Robert. Therefore, once Shin was identified as a potential suspect, police quickly tried to get the Che family away from him. When they contacted Mina and Richard Che to ask if they knew where their cousin was, they were with him. Investigators asked them to come with their cousin to the police station so that they could all be asked some more routine questions. When the 3 of them arrived there, Shin was placed in one room and Mina and Richard in another. While Shin was questioned by police, Richard and Mina were informed that their cousin may have been involved in the attack that had resulted in their father's murder. The news was devastating. At this time, police did not have enough evidence to charge Shin with murder or any charges related to the robbery, but they were afraid for the Chis' safety should he be released. In his statement to police, Shin had claimed that he had never been in contact with anyone involved in the crime. Using the cell phone records that showed him communicating with the cell phones used in the area at the time of the murder, they were able to arrest him on a charge of providing false information to police and hold him. After just a day in jail, Shin changed his story and admitted to his involvement in the home invasion. He told police that he had been bragging about his rich uncle to his friend Joseph Page, a 23-year-old from Philadelphia. Shin told Page that his uncle kept over $100,000 in the safe in his home. Page had a history of committing home invasion robberies and decided that Shin's uncle sounded like an ideal target. He recruited 5 more people to execute the robbery, 2 who would enter the house with him, and 3 who would later be referred to as the cleanup crew, who acted as lookouts and getaway drivers. Shin worked with Page for over a month to orchestrate the robbery. He also attended a meeting to plan the home invasion, where he provided everyone involved with information about his aunt and uncle's daily routine and the location of their safe. He claimed to police that his family was supposed to be left unharmed. It is unclear how he could honestly have been so confident in his relative safety, given the fact that he saw the duct tape, knives, and guns the others had collected to use during the crime. At this meeting, Shin told police that he had learned of his uncle's murder when Page called him upset about the much smaller amount of money in the safe than he had been promised. Page allegedly told Shin that Robert had died because they needed to hurt him a little after he tried to resist during the attack. Because so many people had been involved in the crime, each perpetrator received a relatively small amount of money for their participation. Angelo Shin betrayed his family and got his uncle killed for just $2,000. On February 4, 2009, Shin and the other 6 alleged participants in the home invasion were charged with a crime. Shin was charged with third-degree murder, and the other 5, of whom had been present at the scene, were all charged with both second- and third-degree murder. Page, 25-year-old Amitati Latham, and 18-year-old Curry Pitts were identified as the 3 men who entered the house. Julius Wise, 32, Robert Eatman, 33, and Sybil White, 17, all of Philadelphia, were all charged as members of the so-called cleanup crew. Unfortunately, what this investigation revealed was far more sinister than a simple robbery. Angelo Shin is a traitor of the worst kind. He's a traitor to his family, he's a traitor to his people, and his treachery is of the lowest kind we've ever seen here, Montgomery County District Attorney Risa Vetri-Furman stated when the charges were publicly announced. Page and Latham were tied to the crime by the cell phone data. After they were arrested, they were obligated to provide samples of their DNA, which also tied them both to the scene. Page's DNA was found on the inside of a portion of a finger from a black latex glove, consistent with the type that the Chiss said their attackers wore, found near Robert's body. Latham's DNA was found on some of the duct tape used to restrain the Chiss. Investigators believe it got there when he used his teeth to rip the tape. White, who had been the getaway driver, pled guilty to third-degree murder. At her sentencing hearing, she took full responsibility for her participation in the crime, but also said she had been convinced to participate because she was foolish, stupid, naive, and gullible. She was sentenced to 4 to 8 years in prison, plus 20 years of probation. Eatman also pled guilty to third-degree murder and apologized in court. He received 20 to 40 years in prison, plus 4.5 to 9 years for a robbery charge. Wise, who had participated in the planning of the home invasion and helped cover it up after the fact, pled guilty to third-degree murder the day after his trial for second-degree murder began. He was sentenced to 16 to 32 years in prison. Page and Latham were both witnesses for the prosecution. When Page, Pitts, and Latham went to trial, Page and Latham were both found guilty of second-degree murder, robbery, burglary, and conspiracy. Page was given a consecutive 40 to 80-year prison term over and above a life sentence. Latham was sentenced to life plus 32 to 64 years. Pitts, alleged to have been the third man to actually enter the Che home, was found not guilty at trial, as there was no cell phone or DNA evidence tying him to the crime, and Mina and Janice Che had not gotten a good enough look at him to be able to identify him. Angelo Shin pled guilty to third-degree murder in October of 2010. He was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison for his role in the robbery that cost his uncle his life. He later unsuccessfully appealed the sentence, arguing that it was too severe in light of his cooperation and the remorse he expressed. Robert's death, the trauma of the home invasion, and Angelo Shin's betrayal left the surviving members of the Che family unable to live a normal life. Robert's son Richard has stated that he cannot comprehend how someone could betray their family in such a manner. Early on September 16, 1973, an elderly man took his dog out for a Sunday morning walk near Landersea, a village in South Wales known for being the home of the first oil refinery in the United Kingdom. When he reached a small wooded area during his walk, the man came across what he had first believed to be a mannequin. When he got closer, he realized he was wrong. He had actually discovered the dead body of a young woman. Police were called to the scene and soon found the body of another young woman some 50 yards away from the first. Both teenagers were found with a long length of rope wrapped around their neck. It would later be confirmed that they had been strangled to death with the rope. It would also be determined that they had both been raped. They had been allowed to redress before being killed. The second young woman found also had a serious head injury. It appeared she had briefly escaped her attacker and ran a short distance before he caught her and hit her over the head. Based on where her body was found, it appeared she had nearly made it to a busy nearby road before she was caught. Two local families had been out looking for their teenage daughters who had failed to come home after going out together to a club the night before. When they saw the large police presence at the crime scene, they approached a police officer and asked for assistance. Family members were asked to view the two bodies to determine if they could identify them. The families confirmed that the bodies were those of Geraldine Hughes and Pauline Floyd. Both Geraldine and Pauline came from working-class and family-oriented backgrounds. Geraldine grew up as somewhat of a tomboy, in part because she and her cousin Julie were the only two girls in their extended family. She was just as tough as her male cousins and able to keep up with all of their rough housing. Geraldine had a fun and bubbly personality. Pauline was not as outgoing as Geraldine, but the two were still best friends. In 1973, they were both 16 years old. Both girls had recently finished school and worked together in a local clothing factory. They paid a portion of their income to their parents because they still lived at home, but what little disposable income they had went to their Saturday nights out and the clothes and makeup they wore to the nightclubs. On the evening of September 15, 1973, Pauline and Geraldine were out together at the Top Rank nightclub in Swansea. Geraldine's cousin Phil saw Geraldine and Pauline as they were leaving the nightclub as it was closing down. They were happy and having a good time. He told Geraldine to get home safely before they parted ways. He would never see his cousin alive again. Pauline and Geraldine had arrived in Swansea by bus. However, buses were not running at 1 a.m. when the club shut down for the night, and there were few taxis available. Even if Geraldine and Pauline could have found a taxi, it would have cost them at least £4 to get home, an unreasonable expense considering each only made £16 a week working at the factory. They decided to hitchhike, as was common practice for young people in the area at the time. Pauline and Geraldine lived in the neighboring villages of Landersea and Skewen, respectively. On this night, they were traveling approximately 7 miles to Landersea, as Geraldine was meant to spend the night at Pauline's family home. The last witness to see the girls alive was a passing motorist who reported seeing them getting into a white car. A man named Philip O'Connor saw the girls standing near a bus stop down the road from the nightclub they had visited that night. He then saw a white car pull over and let them in. While Philip was waiting at the next traffic light, the white car pulled up next to him. He glanced over to see Pauline and Geraldine both sitting in the front seat of the car, talking and laughing with the driver. The driver was a man in his early 30s with a mustache and bushy hair, but Philip did not get a very good look at his face. The road along the wooded area where Geraldine and Pauline's bodies were found was a busy one, even in the middle of the night. Drivers reported seeing a white car identified as an Austin 1100 parked near the entrance to the wooded area between 1:45 and 2:15 a.m. the night of the murders. Unfortunately, no one saw the car's registration number. Such a vehicle had also been seen near another crime scene in the area 2 months earlier. That crime had numerous other similarities to the murders of Geraldine and Pauline. Sandra Newton was beautiful with long dark hair. She had a reserved personality but a sweet laugh. Like Geraldine and Pauline, she was 16 years old in 1973. Also like Geraldine and Pauline, she was last seen while out on a Saturday night in South Wales. Sandra was out in the village of Britton Ferry on the night of July 14, 1973. She went to the Traveller's Rest pub and later the Baron nightclub. She left the club at 1 a.m. with her boyfriend. The couple found an abandoned van on a side street and had sex. They parted ways on the street near the local working man's club, and Sandra began the 5 kilometers walk back home. However, it is believed she may have tried to hitchhike to get a ride, like many young people routinely did. Sandra's body was found 2 days later at the entrance of a culvert near an abandoned coal mine in the village of Tunmar. No effort had been made to conceal her body, and police believed her killer must have been a local in order to be familiar with the remote area. Sandra had been beaten about the head and strangled with the hem of her skirt. Police initially reported that she had not been raped. assuming all the evidence of sexual activity found during her autopsy was the result of the consensual sex she had shortly before her death. It would be decades before forensic science showed that this assumption was incorrect. While there were similarities between Sandra's murder and the murders of Pauline and Geraldine, there was some debate amongst investigators over whether or not the same man killed all three girls. There were some investigators who suspected Sandra's boyfriend was responsible for her murder, both because he was the last person to see her and because he was a married man. However, he did not have a driver's license or a car, raising the question of how Sandra's body ended up several miles away from Britain Ferry if he had been her killer. Regardless of whether or not all three girls had been killed by the same man, their murders sent the surrounding communities into a panic. Police officers were everywhere. Parents wouldn't let their teenage daughters out of their sight, and posters were displayed discouraging young people from hitchhiking. Everyone feared the killer could be someone they knew and looked on their neighbors with suspicion. The killer was called the Saturday Night Strangler in the press. Over the years, the murders have also been called the Landersea murders because of where Geraldine and Pauline's bodies were found, or the Port Talbot or Steeltown murders because of their proximity to the city of Port Talbot and the massive steelworks located there. The steelworks employed 13,000 men who lived throughout the surrounding area, so it was conceivable that the killer was connected to it. However, while the community was concerned that the killer was one of their own, a large number of men from across the UK and around the world had reason to be in the area at the time. The annual Neath Fair was on, attracting large crowds and bringing people in from outside the immediate area. Saturday, September 15th, had been the fair's biggest night, and Geraldine and Pauline had actually attended it before going home to get ready for their final Saturday night out. In addition, the M4 motorway was being constructed at the time, with laborers traveling into the area looking for work on the project. Some of them were not residents of the UK and had to be tracked down in other countries if police wanted to speak with them, but did not do so before their work on the motorway was over and they returned home. The Saturday Night Strangler was believed to be the first serial killer in Wales, and the hunt for him was the largest police investigation in Welsh history. More than 150 detectives were brought in to work the case. More than 35,000 people throughout the region were spoken to. 11,000 of them were the owners of white or light-colored vehicles. Even though witnesses identified the suspect vehicle as an Austin 1100 specifically, this was a very common car at the time. Examining all such vehicles and speaking to their owners, even in a relatively small region, was a laborious and time-consuming process. Without computers, police relied on a system of index cards filed and cross-referenced in hundreds of boxes to organize the information from these efforts. Despite the enormity of the investigation, by the spring of 1974, less than a year after Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine were killed, police were out of leads and the investigation wound down. On the third anniversary of Geraldine and Pauline's murders, Geraldine's mother Jean led a protest outside of 10 Downing Street, the official residence and offices of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. 50 of her co-workers from the clothing factory where Geraldine had also worked carried handmade signs with sayings like "Bring back hanging." She brought with her to London a petition she had organized which received more than 9,000 signatures. She told the press, "I can't accept what happened to Geraldine. It has left me very bitter. If they ever catch the person responsible, they should hang him. I want him to feel rope around his neck like the girls felt." The case was revisited periodically as a matter of formality over the following decades, but little progress was made. When DNA analysis came into use by law enforcement, there was little hope it would help solve this case. Even though the girls' underwear was preserved as evidence, in the early days of DNA analysis quite a large sample was required for testing, which was not available in the Saturday Night Strangler investigation. However, by the late 1990s, technology advanced to the point where even a minute sample could be tested for DNA. The Saturday Night Strangler might be identified by his DNA after all. After 2 years of work, only a partial DNA profile of the killer could be extracted from the evidence preserved from Geraldine, but a full DNA profile was developed from Pauline's evidence. However, there was no match to the profile amongst the 1.7 million DNA profiles in the UK's National Criminal DNA Database. So police would have to identify suspects and then take samples of their DNA for testing. In January of 2000, the investigation was formally reopened in hopes of using this DNA profile to finally identify the killer. The renewed effort was named Operation Magnum. The murders had occurred nearly 27 years earlier, and at the time no crime in the United Kingdom had ever been solved after such a long time had passed. Operation Magnum had only been given enough funding to test 500 DNA samples. Given the fact that the original case files contained tens of thousands of names of potential suspects based on their location, criminal history, or ownership of an Austin 1100, narrowing down the suspect pool to the 500 most likely suspects was a massive undertaking. Bert Heritage, former chief of the Behavioral Science Unit of Surrey Police, created a 14-point criminal profile to help identify the killer, which stated that the Saturday Night Strangler would have a history of minor property crimes, live in the region where the murders occurred, and would have started his criminal career at an early age. Because so much time had passed and many men from outside the area had been there at the time of the murders, investigators had to go as far away as New Zealand to get DNA samples from the men they ultimately placed on their relatively short list of suspects. All 353 men asked to provide a DNA sample did so willingly, although some took more convincing than others. None of these samples matched the crime scene DNA. A major breakthrough in the case occurred in October of 2001, when Dr. Jonathan Whitaker, a DNA specialist, managed to identify an unknown male DNA profile from swabs taken from Sandra Newton's body. Initial testing of the swabs from her body had revealed a mix of DNA from 3 people: Sandra, her boyfriend, and another individual. Dr. Whitaker was finally able to isolate the third profile and found it to be a match to the DNA from the other murder scene. While it had long been suspected that Sandra had been killed by the same man who killed Pauline and Geraldine, this evidence finally confirmed that the same man killed all 3 girls. This news was beneficial for police because it confirmed that there had been a serial killer in South Wales in 1973 and that they were looking for only one man for all 3 murders. However, for Sandra's loved ones, the news had varying effects. Sandra's boyfriend at the time of her death had spent nearly 30 years facing suspicion and harassment for his perceived potential involvement in Sandra's murder from members of his community. When police told him that the DNA evidence had proven his innocence, he became emotional and told them he could now finally walk down the street with his head held high. For Sandra's mother, Pat, however, the news was devastating again. Police had initially believed that Sandra had not been sexually assaulted because they knew she had consensual sex shortly before her death, and therefore viewed all the evidence of sexual activity found at her autopsy as the result of her earlier encounter with her boyfriend. However, the presence of semen from the same man who had raped and murdered Pauline and Geraldine on her body proved that Sandra had been raped by her killer. Pat had said ever since Sandra was murdered that the only consolation she had was that her daughter had not been raped before she was killed. Police now had to take away the one small comfort she had in coping with the nightmare that was her daughter's murder. The same month, Dr. Whitaker proposed a novel approach to using the DNA profile to identify the killer. The killer's DNA was not in the criminal database, but what if he had children? Enough time had passed since the murders that even if the killer did not have children until after he killed all 3 girls, his children would now be adults and subject to having their DNA entered into the database should they commit a serious enough crime. Searching for an exact match in the criminal database had not revealed the killer, but what if they looked for partial matches? Dr. Whitaker did ultimately find a DNA profile in the database that could have been from the son of the killer. It belonged to Paul Capin, a local car thief. Capin was a name known to investigators. Joseph Capin, Paul's father, had been suspect number 200 on their list of the 500 most probable suspects based on information from the original investigation. However, when they had tried to collect a sample of his DNA, they had learned that he was dead. Capin was a native of Port Talbot and lived on the Sandfields estate there at the time of the murders. He was sometimes employed as a bouncer or a bus driver and was in and out of jail. His criminal career began when he was just 12 years old, and he racked up more than 30 documented minor offenses ranging from stealing from gas meters to burglary to assault. Capin was a violent man who severely abused and terrorized his wife and 2 children. He also was known to pursue young girls using his various jobs as a bouncer to meet and try to get close to them. Capin had been interviewed on October 13, 1973, because he owned a white Austin 1100 and his name had been given to investigators by a police officer who routinely had to deal with him. Capin told police he had gotten home from the Neath Fair around 9:30 on the night of Pauline and Geraldine's murders and had been home with his wife the rest of the night. She corroborated his story, as she had long since been conditioned to do whenever police came asking questions to avoid violence from her husband. Capin's white Austin had been up on blocks in the yard with the wheels removed when police came for the interview. He told them that the car had been there since the day after the murders. This was a lie. In the week after the murders, police were stopping any and all white Austin 1100s in the area to question their drivers. Capin had been stopped while driving the vehicle during this effort, meaning the car was still in use long after he said it was out of operation. The lie was not noticed until DNA made Capin the prime suspect in 2001. Police hypothesized that he took the wheels off the car after it was reported in newspapers that police had found tire tracks at the crime scene. Capin and his wife had eventually divorced. His ex-wife and daughter cooperated with police and provided samples of their DNA. Comparing the DNA of Capin's 2 children and their mother to the crime scene DNA, scientists were able to say that Capin was still the likely suspect. However, they still did not have a direct DNA sample from him. While it appeared that Capin was the Saturday Night Strangler, investigators wanted to be able to say with certainty that his DNA was a match to that from the crime scenes. On Christmas Eve of 2001, investigators submitted an application to the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom requesting permission to exhume the body of Joseph Capin. They used all of the familial DNA testing as evidence supporting the exhumation. The application was approved, and the exhumation was scheduled for May of 2002. Investigators and a forensics team set up a tent over Capin's grave on May 15, 2002, so that they were prepared to begin the exhumation rite at midnight. There had been good weather for most of the day, but as the exhumation grew closer, a storm rolled in. Capin had been buried in a family plot when he died in 1990 at the age of 49, and his coffin was between those of his grandfather and stepfather. Right when the team reached Capin's coffin, a huge clap of thunder sounded. Multiple members of the team reported feeling uneasy, as if something evil was being brought up to the surface. Capin's remains were taken to Marston Hospital in Swansea for examination. A tooth and one of his femurs were taken into evidence so that scientists could attempt to extract DNA from them before the remains were reinterred. DNA was successfully extracted from the remains, and the profile was a match to that from the crime scenes. Nearly 30 years after Sandra Newton, Geraldine Hughes, and Pauline Floyd were murdered, Joseph Capin was identified as their killer and their cases were closed. Familial DNA and the related technique of investigative genetic genealogy developed later in the age of commercial DNA sites have become common investigative techniques. In 2002, such techniques were groundbreaking. The Saturday Night Strangler case is believed to be the first case in which familial DNA was ever used, as well as the first case to ever be solved by it. Solving this case after so much time had passed was an extraordinary achievement, especially for the time period. However, investigators were somewhat disappointed in the outcome of the case. They had been working in hopes of arresting and prosecuting the killer so that he could be punished for what he had done. Capin had avoided conviction and incarceration. They had found answers in their investigation, but no justice for Sandra, Pauline, and Geraldine. Once Capin's name was made public, multiple women came forward saying they believed he was the man who had assaulted or attempted to abduct them back in the 1960s or 70s. He is the main suspect in 2 rapes that involved ropes and took place in the months before Sandra's murder. However, the evidence in those cases was destroyed, so it cannot be tested for DNA. He is also a suspect in the death of Morn Mahi, a 23-year-old mother of 2 who was found strangled after a night out in Aberraven in February of 1976. DNA was not found when the evidence from her case was re-examined in 2002, but there has been a push for investigators to examine it again now that technology has advanced further. Capin developed lung cancer in 1988. Maybe it was karma catching up to him, or just the somewhat expected outcome of his pack-a-day smoking habit. He wasted away over the next 2 years and needed a wheelchair in the end. There appear to be no public statements from his family about his actual death. We can only hope that it was painful and that he fought for his final breaths. He never felt the rope of a noose around his neck as Geraldine's mother had once hoped, but hopefully he felt the fear caused by being unable to breathe that he had inflicted on his victims all those years earlier. Pauline, Geraldine, and Sandra's murderer was not identified for almost 30 years. Despite this, their parents all lived to learn the killer's name. Pauline's father, Trevor, was 89 years old at the time and relieved he was able to live long enough to see the identification made. Geraldine's parents, Denver and Jean, broke down in tears when they learned Capin had been confirmed to be the man who had taken their daughter from them. They went to Geraldine's grave after they received the news. Denver later told the press, "We took a few flowers to Geraldine's grave and had a few quiet words with her. We felt we had put her to rest properly at long last." Holland was born on July 8, 1947, the second of Geraldine and Charles Shotgun Holland's 4 children. She was born and raised in the mountains of western North Carolina, for her family ties went back for generations. The Hollands lived in the town of Canton, where the economy relied heavily on the local paper mill, where Brenda's father worked as a floor manager. Brenda's parents felt secure in the community and hoped their children would remain in the relative safety of their mountains. Brenda's ambitions would take her away from Canton, but she was mindful of her parents' feelings and getting their approval as she went after each of her goals. While some of her choices may have seemed drastic to her parents, Brenda took their concerns into consideration when making her plans. Brenda was the first member of her family to attend college. Her family physician, Dr. Matthews, had encouraged her to enroll at Campbell College. The small Baptist institution was in North Carolina, but still nearly 300 miles away in the town of Beauties Creek. Brenda's father was not opposed to his daughter receiving a college education, but her mother was worried about paying for college and about her daughter being so far away from home. With the help of Dr. Matthews, Brenda was able to work out the logistical concerns of going away to school and got her mother to agree to letting her attend. Brenda eventually wanted to move off of campus and into a boarding house run by a local widow, but knew this would be pushing her parents' limits. She ultimately secured their permission by taking care of the necessary preparations and by appealing to the amount of money the move would save each month. Brenda became very active with the drama program at the school and soon got a paid position as a costumer for the Campbell players. She was successful in this position due to both her creativity and her hardworking nature. She considered staying on campus during a semester break to do more for the department, because she was concerned that completing her assigned tasks alone did not merit the paycheck she received. Brenda dreamed of having a career in theater and considered moving to New York City to work odd jobs while making connections with the Broadway community. However, she knew that her parents would never approve of such a plan, and therefore made slightly more local arrangements for her employment over the summer of 1967 following her sophomore year of college. Brenda had been hired to be the makeup supervisor for The Lost Colony, an outdoor symphonic drama that had been staged in the town of Manio in North Carolina's Outer Banks since 1937. While a local production may not seem comparable to a Broadway play, working on The Lost Colony was a major opportunity for Brenda. The play, which details the history and mystery of the Roanoke colony and the unexplained disappearance of more than 100 of its settlers, continues to be a major and respected production to this day. During the 1966 season, the year before Brenda was hired to work on the play, more than 145,000 tickets had been sold for the outdoor performance throughout its summer run. As of 2022, more than 4 million people have seen the production, and it received an honorary Tony Award in 2013. Working on The Lost Colony would allow Brenda to work with multiple individuals in the theater community with experience within and outside of North Carolina. Her position as the makeup supervisor gave her the chance to work under famed costumer Irene Smartrains, famous for her work as the costume director for the Carolina Playmakers at the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill. Joe Layton, who directed and choreographed The Lost Colony for the 1967 season, had extensive credits working on Broadway and in television. One of the most popular television stars of the time also had ties to The Lost Colony and to Manio, Andy Griffith, who in 1967 was near the end of the 8th season run of his successful eponymous television show, owned a home in Manio and spent time there when he wasn't filming. His love of the town stemmed from his time there working on The Lost Colony. One of his earliest stage roles had been as a soldier in the play, and he would return for several more seasons, eventually playing the role of Sir Walter Raleigh. As good of an opportunity working on The Lost Colony would be for Brenda, her parents did not want her moving even farther away from their home for the summer. They instead wanted her to come home to Canton and go back to her job at a local drive-in. arguing that she would make more than the $45 a week she would earn working on the play by doing so. They eventually relented and signed off on her employment contract for the summer, as was required at the time. Brenda's parents were frustrated to learn that their daughter ultimately would be unable to come home to see them at the end of her spring semester before heading to the coast to start work on the play. The last time they had seen her was at the end of March for Easter. This meant they had not seen Brenda since she had decided to dramatically change her hair on May 12th, dyeing it blonde and cutting it into a stylish bob. On May 31st, 1967, Brenda caught a ride from Bowie's Creek to Mainio from a fellow Campbell student, who had occasionally taken Brenda out on dates and was a native of Mainio. For the summer, Brenda would share an efficiency apartment on the upper level of a local family's home with another student working on the Lost Colony for the season. Brenda's dedication to her job quickly earned her the respect of those she worked with, and she built up a social life in Mainio based largely around the play. She quickly began integrating into the Lost Colony community and the coastal community of Mainio. While Brenda may not have been living a conservative lifestyle by her parents' standards, she was social and curious rather than wild and rebellious. She mainly attended parties not to drink or cause trouble, but for the opportunity to speak to a variety of people, sometimes ending the night still holding the same beer she had started the night with. She went out on casual dates with a few men in the weeks following her arrival in Mainio, with her supervisor from the play keeping a watchful eye on her and giving her advice on how to avoid being taken advantage of. Unable to spend time with her younger brother and sister as she was accustomed to, Brenda got to know the younger members of the cast and crew, including a 13-year-old boy who sold seat cushions at the theater. He had suffered from rheumatoid arthritis and had never learned to swim, so Brenda taught him how to at Nags Head Beach and reassured him when he struggled. Brenda kept in touch with her parents by regularly sending them letters. At the performance of The Lost Colony on July 1st, 1967, everything seemed perfectly normal to the audience, but backstage the cast and crew was growing concerned. Brenda Holland had not shown up for work. While an unexplained absence may not have been cause for alarm when it came to some members of the crew, when it was Brenda involved, it was. While she had only been working on the play for a month, she had never missed a shift. Furthermore, Cora Twyford, who performed as a colonist in the play and was Brenda's landlady, reported that Brenda had not come home the night before. While it was common for some of her boarders to stay out all night, like Brenda's roommate, who had not arrived home until 7 a.m. that morning, it was unheard of for Brenda to do so. Brenda had left after the previous night's performance with Danny Barber, a chorus singer in the play, to go out on a date at intermission. Cora Twyford and the play's general manager asked Danny when he had last seen Brenda. At first, he stated that he had dropped her off in front of the house where she was staying. When Cora told him she knew that this wasn't true, because Brenda had never come home, he admitted that he and Brenda had gone back to his house after their date. They'd been talking and reading magazines in his room, and he fell asleep. When he woke up that morning, Brenda was gone, and he assumed that at some point after he fell asleep, she had walked a few blocks back to where she was staying on her own. The general manager called the sheriff's office to report Brenda missing at 9:20 p.m. and drove over programs for the play, which contained a photo of Brenda, to the office. After the conclusion of the night's performance, after a sleepless night, he called the sheriff's office again at 6 o'clock the following morning to reiterate his concerns and try to get the investigation pushed forward. Even though it was a Sunday, the sheriff's investigation began that morning, and alerts about Brenda's disappearance went out throughout the state. However, notifying Brenda's family that she was missing proved difficult, as no one was answering the phone at the family home. Brenda's older sister, and learned that her sister was missing through a radio broadcast she heard over the AM radio in her car on her way home from church Sunday evening, and knew why her family had not answered their phone, and why no one in Canton was able to find them. The family had gone to stay at a remote trailer they owned near Lake Glenville, an hour west of Canton. The trailer had no phone, so once and notified the Hayward County Sheriff's Office of their location, a deputy was sent out to notify Brenda's parents of her disappearance. The Holland family had gone to bed early that night, so they were all asleep when the deputy arrived. After learning their daughter was missing, Brenda's parents quickly packed up and left for Canton, so that they could drop off their two youngest children with their oldest daughter, and her family before continuing on to Mainio to help look for Brenda. On Monday morning, approximately 75 volunteers joined sheriff's deputies in a search for Brenda. Most of the volunteers were cast or crew members from the Lost Colony. The scale of the search increased over the following few days. Helicopters from the Coast Guard searched from the air, and soldiers from the Marines joined the effort. The search parties grew as Brenda's family members and fellow students at Kimball College arrived to help. On July 6th at 10:15 in the morning, a pilot with a Civil Air Patrol spotted something in the Albemarle Sound off the coast of a small fishing village northwest of Mainio. When he circled back at a lower altitude to look again, he realized that the object in the water below was, in fact, a human body. He radioed in what he had found and circled the area so as to not lose sight of it until law enforcement arrived. The body was pulled from the water and confirmed to be Brenda Holland. Brenda's body was driven to Norfolk, Virginia, so that her autopsy could be performed at the office of the Virginia State Medical Examiner. North Carolina did not have a statewide medical examiner's office at the time, and the facility in Virginia was the closest one with the best equipment and experienced pathologists. Brenda had wounds around her neck, and the pathologist found that she had died as the result of ligature strangulation. He also found signs that Brenda had been raped. Whether or not rape was the motive for Brenda's murder is not entirely certain. Investigators were initially confused as to why her killer would redress her so exactly after raping her. When her body was found, she was still wearing her underwear, a bodysuit, and a tight skirt, still completely buttoned up. Furthermore, witness accounts of statements made by Brenda indicate that the injuries that pointed to her being raped may have been inflicted in a separate incident days before her death. Brenda had confided in her supervisor, Irene Rains, that she had a bad experience while on a date with a local man she had been seeing. Brenda stated, "I'm no good," and said that she would no longer be seeing the man. She further confided in Danny Barber, her date on her last evening alive, about the incident. During an interview with authorities, he stated that Brenda had told him about this man and his mistreatment of her. He said she told him about him going to bed with her about the rough treatment. It was very repulsive and had changed her outlook on life. If Brenda had been raped by this man while on a date earlier on in the week, these specific injuries found on her body may not have been connected to her murder, but rather to the earlier assault, leaving the question of whether or not she had been raped just prior to her murder open. Brenda's body was taken back to Canton for her funeral and burial. Her parents received mourners at a local funeral home on the evening of July 8th, the day that should have been Brenda's 20th birthday. Her funeral was held the following afternoon at her family church, and she was buried in a lot in the cemetery her parents had purchased just a few years earlier, with the belief that their children will be burying them there first. Some of the friends Brenda had made during her time in Mainio while working on the Lost Colony traveled to Canton for her funeral. 100 other members of the cast and crew attended a memorial service held for her back in Mainio, which was held at the same time as the service in Canton. Dare County Sheriff Frank Cahoon quickly zeroed in on Brenda's last date, Danny Barber, as his main suspect, and Danny was one of the first people he contacted when Brenda went missing. 24-year-old Danny had served 3 years in the Army, where he had been a member of the U.S. Army Band, and was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. 1967 was his third season as a singer in the Lost Colony. According to Danny, after the performance on June 30th, he and Brenda had gone to a bar, where they each had one beer, and then to Jeanette's Pier to watch people who were shark fishing. They returned to the home he was sharing with 2 housemates just after 2 a.m., and went up to Danny's bedroom because they did not want to make noise in the living room and disturb one of Danny's housemates, who they knew was home. Danny and Brenda then talked for a while and kissed, but did not have sex. They then passed a magazine back and forth, reading articles to each other. At some point, Danny fell asleep and woke up hours later to find Brenda gone. He assumed she had just walked home rather than wake him up to get a ride. When first asked about when he last saw Brenda by the play's general manager on July 1st, Danny at first lied and said he had dropped her off at the home where she was staying around 2 a.m., when he had in fact taken her to his place at that time and had never taken her home. This initial falsehood made him look suspicious, although it may have been the product of Danny's more conservative nature rather than him having something to hide. Danny would later tell the play's general manager that he was afraid of Brenda's boss, Irene Raines. Irene was very concerned about the young people who worked under her, and if she had thought that the interactions between crew members was inappropriate, she would not hesitate to confront them about it. Danny, unaware of the seriousness of the situation at the time of the questioning, may not have wanted Irene to find out that he had been alone in his bedroom with Brenda. Furthermore, Danny's failure to take Brenda home seems to have violated his own understanding of gentlemanly conduct. According to Cora Twyford's daughter, Penny, Danny came to their house to apologize to her mother for failing to see Brenda safely back to the room Cora was renting out to her. He appeared to have recognized that he made a mistake and was upset over it. Regardless of the reason for this initial lie, Danny was still the last known person to have seen Brenda, and he admitted to being alone with her in his bedroom. It was not inconceivable to the sheriff that he may have wanted more from Brenda sexually, and killed her when she did not consent. However, Danny's version of events did appear to be supported by a statement from his housemate, who had been in his room that night. He heard Danny and a girl go up to Danny's room, and was woken up later that night by the sound of the front door opening and someone quietly exiting the house. He did not, however, hear any signs of a struggle inside the house, where the sound of a car starting up after the door to the house was opened. If Danny had killed Brenda in his room, he would have needed to get her downstairs and transport her by car to the water to dispose of her body, which would have created a lot of noise. What the housemate heard sounds more in line with Brenda waking up and deciding to walk home, rather than waking up Danny to drive her. While Brenda's parents were in town, when her body was found and could have identified it in a more clinical setting, Sheriff Cahoon apparently hoped to rattle his prime suspect with the sight of Brenda's badly decomposed body. Jeannie Barber was therefore brought in to identify Brenda's body as it lay in a hearse near where it was found. Danny had to step away for a moment after seeing her, but then confirmed that it was Brenda. He based his identification off of a necklace Brenda always wore, which she had been given for winning Miss Congeniality in the Miss Hayward County Beauty Pageant the year before. Danny came in for multiple, often hours-long interviews, including one that kept him from attending Brenda's memorial service. In the days after her body was found, Danny would later state that nothing he told the officers seemed to convince them that he hadn't killed Brenda. His brother eventually convinced him to hire a lawyer, who placed limits on law enforcement's access to Danny. Authorities remained focused on Danny in their investigation and continued to put pressure on him. An agent from the State Bureau of Investigation was in the audience of every performance of The Lost Colony Danny sang in for the rest of the summer. Agents from the SBI interviewed Danny twice in Chapel Hill after he returned to school, once in November of 1967 and once in April of 1968. The SBI tracked his changes in residence and his employment as he entered the corporate world after graduation. In the following years, those who knew Danny and Brenda generally did not believe Danny could have had anything to do with Brenda's murder. Whispers of his involvement nevertheless persisted throughout town, with a popular rumor maintaining that Danny left Manio at the end of the summer of 1967 and never returned, which some believed pointed towards his guilt. This was not true. However, Dan, as he was known once he began his successful career in business, vacationed in their county with his family regularly, with their last trip occurring just months before he passed away. He took his wife, Diane, and later their 2 children to see the Lost Colony. He told Diane about Brenda's murder and how police had tried to pin the crime on him. She does not believe that her husband could have returned to Manio, much less brought his family there, had he been involved. The 2 main emotions he seems to have felt about the events of the summer of 1967 were genuine confusion over how anyone could have wanted to harm Brenda, and gratitude for his brother insisting he retained a lawyer when he did not know what to do in the face of intense interrogation. Dan was contacted by the SBI again in 1985 and 1995, and according to the SBI files, he was open and cooperative. He retired as Vice President of National Sales for Sara Lee Hosiery in 1994, and turned his attention back to his love of singing and performing. Dan Barber passed away unexpectedly in January of 2011, just days after his 68th birthday. While Dan Barber was the most popular suspect with law enforcement, years after Brenda's murder, new information would point to a new suspect who had no connection to Brenda at all, and no chance of being convicted of the crime, as he was by then long since deceased. For many years, Dr. Linus Edwards was the only dentist in Mainio. On Valentine's Day of 1971, Dr. Edwards went to the home of Dr. Harvey, Mainio's general practitioner, to drop off the set of dentures he had ordered. Dr. Harvey and his wife were at a Valentine's Day party, but had left their front door unlocked. So Dr. Edwards went inside and left the dentures on the dining room table. Early that evening, Dr. Edwards made 3 phone calls, one to his lawyer, one to Sheriff Cahoon, and one to Dr. Harvey, asking them to come to his house. He then shot himself in the head with his .22 caliber pistol. His lawyer discovered him lying on his kitchen floor when he arrived at the house an hour after being called there. Dr. Edwards was taken to the Naval Hospital in Norfolk, Virginia, where he remained unconscious until 5 a.m. on February 16th, when he finally died. He did not leave a suicide note. Edwards was a native of Durham, North Carolina, and a member of Mensa, something he was very proud of. He served as a dentist with the United States Army, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel. Edwards was also a violent drunk. While Edwards was still in the Army, he once choked his wife so savagely and intently that her young daughter had to threaten him with a mallet to get him to stop. He was granted an honorable discharge after undergoing psychiatric treatment, just 3 years before he would have been eligible for his full military pension. Edwards' first wife, Ida, had divorced him after 20 years of marriage in 1956, and then remarried him in 1960, with this marriage lasting just a few years. It was during the second attempt at their marriage that Edwards came to Mainio, which did not have a dental office at the time, and opened a successful practice. Following his second divorce from Ida, Edwards married Dottie Fry, a young widow with 2 children and a long-standing family history in Mainio. He and Dottie were married from 1964 until 1969, during which time Dottie was subjected to violence and abuse. Edwards physically beat his wife at least once, so badly that she needed to be hospitalized, and she and her children had to flee the home they shared with Edwards on multiple occasions. Edwards would regularly get blackout drunk, which would lead to physical and/or verbal abuse. While Edwards himself had an ongoing affair during the marriage, he was very jealous and controlling of Dottie's interactions with others. He did not like her having any friends, whether they were male or female. Edwards was briefly considered a suspect in Brenda's murder after investigators received tips that he and his wife, who bore a strong physical resemblance to Brenda Holland, had domestic difficulties on the night of June 30th, and that he had drunkenly gone out that night looking for her after she fled their home. Edwards agreed to undergo a polygraph examination and passed. However, while these exams are notoriously unreliable under the best of circumstances, Edwards may also have had advantages that helped him appear truthful during the test. Just after the time Brenda was killed, he began wearing an upper body cast for some sort of unexplained neck or back injury, and he secured a prescription for Demerol, as John Rayleigh would later write. Blackout drunks, free of feelings of guilt and zonked out on Demerol as Edwards might have been, can sail through the tests. Early on in the investigation, Edwards told law enforcement that his wife probably wouldn't talk to them, so they did not attempt to contact her. She might not have been forthcoming at that time because she was afraid of her husband, but investigators simply taking Edwards at his word shows an unusual amount of deference. Edwards' car and home were never searched. Edwards was formally ruled out as a suspect in September of 1967. Baldati may have been too afraid to speak with investigators while she was still married to Edwards. Even if they had asked her, she was willing to speak with them after his death. However, they were not as interested in hearing from her. Former Mainio Police Chief Ken Whittingham never formally had jurisdiction over Brenda's case because her body had been found outside of city limits, but that did not diminish his interest in the case while he was with the department or after his departure from it in 1974. In 1979, while looking into the case on his own, Ken spoke to Dottie Fry. His notes indicate that on January 21st of that year, she had told him that she had unsuccessfully tried to speak to both Sheriff Cahoon and an SBI agent named Lenny Wise multiple times about her ex-husband's potential involvement in Brenda's murder, but neither man was interested in speaking with her. It seemed to Dottie that they were both still convinced of Danny Barber's guilt. 6 years later, journalist Ray Pye was working on investigative pieces on Brenda's murder for the Outer Banks Current, and Ken was one of the people who spoke to him about the case. After learning about Ken's conversation with Dottie, Ray Pye contacted the SBI by phone in December of 1985 and told them of the importance of speaking with both Dottie and Ken. On April 7, 1986, almost 19 years after Brenda's murder, investigators finally interviewed Dottie Fry, and her statement provided important evidence pointing to her former husband being Brenda's killer. This interview was brief, and Dottie told her general theory of what she believed happened the night Brenda was killed, but she more fully elaborated on the events of that night in an article written by Ray Pye and published on August 7, 1986. Dottie's children spent a large part of their summers with their father's family in Carthage, North Carolina, some 200 miles away from Manio, so Dottie was alone with Edwards on the evening of June 30, 1967, when he, not surprisingly, became belligerently drunk. He started yelling at Dottie, and she yelled back. He told her he was going to kill her. Dottie decided not to stay to see if he meant it. She fled the house before the altercation became physical. She got into her van and went to pick up her best friend. They drove around for the rest of the night, making a few stops throughout the Manio area. At least the beginning of Dottie's account was corroborated by two of her neighbors, because her windows had been opened that night. Their neighbors heard the fight, Edwards threatening Dottie, and Dottie's van driving away. They also later heard Edwards' car driving away. At least one of Dottie's friends also reported Edwards showing up at her house and angrily looking through each room in the home for Dottie that night. Dottie waited a few days for her husband to sober up before returning home. When Edwards came home and saw her there, he went pale and said, "I thought you were dead." According to Dottie, Edwards would later claim to have killed Brenda Holland on multiple occasions while he was intoxicated. Dottie believed her former husband killed Brenda in the case of mistaken identity. While Dottie was older than Brenda, both women were tall and thin with long necks and bobbed blonde hair. If Edwards had come across Brenda from behind as she was walking home from Danny Barber's home in his intoxicated state, and with his headlights as his only source of light, he may have thought that Brenda was Dottie, and attacked her as he had a long history of doing to his wife. With so little light and in such an inebriated state, he may not have noticed that he had killed a different woman. Even after he strangled her, potentially with the braided rope straps of her handbag, still drunk and still without light, he conceivably still could have believed the woman he killed was Dottie. Even after putting her body in his car and taking it to a nearby bridge to throw it into the water, Edwards also would have had reason to believe his wife would have been in the neighborhood where he theoretically came across Brenda. Dottie was friends with both of Danny Barber's housemates and worked with one of them. Edwards did not like that his wife was friends with a young man. It may have been in that area that night, checking to see if she were at their house. Dottie had, in fact, stopped at the house earlier in the evening during her drive around town with her best friend. No one was at the house when she arrived, so she took a beer from the fridge and left a note before leaving. Edward's behavior seems to indicate that, for a time, he did believe that he had killed his wife. He had his mistress come over to the home he shared with Dottie, which was not something he typically did. Neighbors saw her car at his house on Saturday and Sunday. Edwards went to the sheriff's office around 1 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, July 2nd, to report his wife missing, but claimed that she had left home after an argument just a few hours earlier, when she had actually left more than 24 hours earlier. After making his report, he went home and went to bed after about 20 minutes, potentially indicating that he was not actually concerned about anything authorities might find looking for Dottie, and that he had just made the report with the incorrect timeline to make it appear as though he was appropriately concerned for his wife. He was never questioned about the inconsistencies between his timeline and the statements of his neighbors, despite the fact that they were obvious and known to investigators well before Edwards was cleared as a suspect. Former Sheriff Cahoon, who had retired a few years before Dottie Fry's claims were made public, did not support the theory that Brenda's murder had been the result of mistaken identity, arguing that Brenda had been smothered with a pillow or blanket, indicating that he was still a proponent of the theory that she had been killed, and someone, presumably Danny Barber, had done so at his house. However, the pathologist had found that Brenda had been strangled, not suffocated, and no evidence contradicted that finding. Brenda's family was not notified when Dottie made her statement to the SBI. They only learned of this alternative suspect in the case when a relative happened to read the newspaper article Ray Pye wrote after speaking with Dottie. The family had still received periodic phone calls from Sheriff Cahoon as the years passed. But he always told them that Danny Barber was the most likely suspect, and they simply lacked enough evidence to file charges against him. Brenda's murder devastated her family, affecting her siblings and her parents in different, but profound and painful ways. Her father, Charles, believing Sheriff Cahoon's assertion of Danny's probable guilt, grew angry with the sheriff for failing to make the case against the young man. He would also express his regret over not exacting revenge against the man he believed killed his daughter. Neither of Brenda's parents would live to see their daughter's case resolved. Charles Holland passed away in 2003, and his wife Geraldine followed a decade later. They are both buried near Brenda in their family plot. In 2018, in response to a series of articles written by John Rayleigh for the Coastland Times about Brenda's murder, the SBI assigned a specialized cold case investigator to the case. Unfortunately, Brenda's case may not benefit from the passage of time and the advancement of science the same way other older cases have. In recent years, problems with the evidence in Brenda's case began almost as soon as the investigation did. The necklace she always wore was removed, rinsed, and photographed after she was pulled from the water. The necklace was then given to her father just a few hours later. Well, this was, of course, an act of kindness towards Charles Holland. The necklace would have been of great evidentiary importance, especially given the fact that it was determined that Brenda had been strangled. The clothes Brenda was found wearing were washed shortly after her body was found, potentially eliminating trace evidence, along with a strong smell that most likely led to them being cleaned. This is not currently relevant, however, as the clothes could not be tested now, regardless of them having been washed. All of the physical evidence from Brenda's case has been lost. Previously, physical evidence from cases the SBI was involved in remained stored at the SBI laboratory. Following a policy change, evidence in these cases was returned to the local law enforcement agencies with whom the cases originated. It is not clear if the evidence from Brenda's case went missing while it was in the custody of the SBI or the Deer County Sheriff's Office. It is not unheard of for evidence from older cases to be intentionally destroyed, but there is no record of this occurring, and it would be unusual for evidence from a case that had received so much statewide attention to have been destroyed. Ongoing efforts to solve the case are also hampered by the fact that there are no photos from the crime scene where Brenda's body was found to examine. According to notes from the SBI file, a state trooper took photographs at the scene near where Brenda's body was found, but the exposures were all blank when they were developed. Renowned local photographer Acock Brown also took photographs at the scene, and 2 witnesses have reported seeing the photos in the past, but the current whereabouts of the photos are unknown. They are not with the case files or with Mr. Brown's private collection of his photographs, which was donated to the Outer Banks History Center. No photos from Brenda's autopsy in Virginia can be located either. While the evidence against Dr. Linus Edwards is only circumstantial, Brenda's younger sister, Kim Holland Thorne, believes he is most likely the killer, and that his connections to local law enforcement influenced the investigation into Brenda's murder. After speaking with Dottie and others in Manio, I concluded that Sheriff Cahoon's friendship with Dr. Edwards kept the whole truth from being divulged when Dr. Edwards committed suicide. There was sort of an attitude of let sleeping dogs lie, she told the Raleigh News and Observer in 1997. Investigative efforts on the case did seem to die down following Edwards' death, except for the SBI keeping track of where Danny Barber was living and working. Kim Thorne has asked that the SBI formally declare Edwards as Brenda's killer based on Dottie Fry's statements, but the agency has not agreed to do so. They did offer to close Brenda's case without identifying her murderer, but Kim will not stand for that. I said, "Oh hell no, it will not be closed until you say who the killer was," she said in 2018. She, furthermore, wants both her sister and the consequences of unprofessionalism are to not be forgotten. "I want it remembered. I want it at the top of the list for unsolved murders in North Carolina. They need to remember that sometimes the good old boys club doesn't work, and it's wrong," she told WTKR News in 2018. Brenda's memory, of course, lives on in the hearts and minds of her family and friends, but they hope to preserve her memory in Manio as well. For several years, there have been efforts to get a plaque memorializing Brenda installed somewhere on the property where the Lost Colony continues to be performed each summer. This process has been complicated by the fact that the property is a part of the National Park Service and subject to certain rules and regulations. Hopefully, these issues can be resolved, so that whether or not her case is ever solved, Brenda can be remembered by all of those who come to see the play that tragically showcased her final work more than 50 years ago. Loved to sing, and shared her love of music with her family. She was a beloved second-grade teacher at Milton Elementary School in Milton, Vermont. When she was off from her full-time job for summer breaks, Rita also worked part-time as a maid at the South Burlington Colonial Motor Inn. 24-year-old Rita remained living at home with her parents and siblings, even after she began working full-time. That changed in the summer of 1971. However, when Rita saw an advertisement for a room that was for rent for the summer in an apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont, after deciding she was a good fit with the potential roommates, Rita decided to move in for the summer. She shared one room with a young woman named Beverly, and a couple, Carrie and Paul, lived in the apartment's other bedroom. On July 19, 1971, Rita had only been living in the apartment for 2 weeks. That night, her roommates Carrie and Paul went out to dinner, and then went to a bar called the Harbor Hideaway. Around 11:15, they called their apartment to see if their roommates wanted to join them for a drink. Beverly answered the phone and told them she would meet them there. She did not invite Rita because she was already asleep. Beverly left the apartment at 11:20 p.m. Paul and Carrie returned home at 12:30 a.m. on July 20th, and Beverly arrived shortly thereafter. When Beverly entered her bedroom, she discovered Rita's body and called out to her roommates for help. Rita had been viciously attacked. Her autopsy found that she had been severely beaten, raped, and then strangled to death. She had fought fiercely against her killer. She appeared to have been asleep at the time the attack began, as she had curlers in her hair and was surrounded by scraps of her clothing, including her nightgown. All of her clothes had been ripped from her body during the attack. Based on her roommate's movements, it was determined that the window of time during which the murder occurred was just 70 minutes. Police collected evidence, followed up on leads, and interviewed neighbors. No arrests were made. Authorities later actively investigated the possibility that serial killer Ted Bundy was Rita's murderer. He had been actively killing at the time of her murder, and the motel where Rita worked was next to the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers, where Bundy had been born. Rita's sister, Mary, even wrote to Bundy, asking him if he had been involved in Rita's murder. No evidence was ever found tying Bundy to the crime, and 45 minutes prior to his execution in 1989, when asked if he had ever killed anyone in Vermont, Bundy said no. Decades would pass, but police interest in solving the case did not diminish. In 2014, authorities in Vermont went out of state for help in processing evidence from the scene. The New York City office of the chief medical examiner processed evidence, looking for DNA. While the slides made from vaginal swabs taken during Rita's autopsy were too degraded to identify DNA, they were able to sequence a male DNA profile from a cigarette, but that had been found next to Rita's body. It would later be determined that this profile was a match to DNA also found on Rita's nightgown. However, there was not a match to the profile in any criminal database. Rita's case was reopened in 2019, and instead of having one investigator working on the case, as was protocol for cold cases, an entire team was assigned to investigate her murder. Genetic genealogy was used to identify relatives of the man whose DNA was found at the crime scene. In combing through their family trees, investigators came across the name of someone who had been interviewed about the case back in 1971. This man had since died, but he had a half-brother living in Alabama who agreed to provide a sample of his DNA. The sample confirmed that this man's half-brother was the contributor of the DNA that was found at the crime scene. On February 21, 2023, Burlington police announced that they had identified the suspect in Rita's case as William DeRose. DeRose and his wife had lived in the same building as Rita, 2 floors above her apartment. Shortly after Rita's murder, DeRose had moved to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk. He and his wife divorced after not seeing each other for some time. DeRose eventually moved back to the United States and remarried. He died of a drug overdose in San Francisco in 1986. An informant had identified DeRose as a potential suspect early on in the investigation. However, when police interviewed his wife, Michelle, she said that her husband had been with her at the time of the murder. When she was re-interviewed 50 years later, Michelle admitted that DeRose had not been with her. He had argued with her that night and then gone out for a walk to cool off. Because they lived in Rita's building, police had notified DeRose and his wife of the murder the morning after it occurred. According to Michelle, as soon as he closed the door, her husband had turned to her and told her to say she had been with him all night if police asked her any questions. Therefore, when she was formally interviewed by police, Michelle provided her husband with an alibi. Police do not believe Michelle knew her husband killed Rita. They view her dishonesty as the result of her being coerced by her husband, rather than as her being a willing accomplice and covering up his crime. DeRose did have a history of manipulating women and went on to commit acts of domestic violence and violence against women. He once strangled his second wife until she became unconscious, and on another occasion he stabbed one of her friends, seemingly at random. Rita's parents passed away before DeRose was identified, but her brother and sister did get to learn who took their beloved sister from them. While DeRose cannot be prosecuted for the murder, investigators say they are unanimously certain that he killed Rita, and the case is now closed. Mobley Hall experienced loss early in life, but it only made her more dedicated to helping others. She was raised by her grandmother because her mother died shortly after the birth of Sarah's sister, Mary. According to Mary, Sarah treated her as though she were her own child and always had faith in her. Sarah was very outgoing and well-liked by those who knew her. In 1984, 27-year-old Sarah was a single mother living in the Hidden Valley neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. She worked with children with special needs, like her son, 10-year-old Derek Mobley. Derek had a jovial personality and was very close with his mother. On March 14, 1984, police were called to Sarah and Derek's apartment, which was in a complex on Venture Way. They had been called because the door to the apartment was open, and a foul odor was coming from inside the home. When police entered the apartment, they discovered the bodies of both Sarah and Derek. They had both been strangled, and Sarah had also been badly beaten. Sarah's sister, Mary, worked near Sarah's apartment and spent a lot of time at the home with her sister and nephew. "I carried a burden for years because I felt like I should have been with her," Mary later said. "It would have never happened if I was with her." Decades would pass before an arrest was made in the case. Finally, on February 1, 2023, 60-year-old James Thomas Pratt was arrested without incident in York County, South Carolina. He was extradited back to North Carolina to be charged with Sarah and Derek's murders. While he does have a criminal record, he's only ever been charged with minor misdemeanors. He lived in the same neighborhood as Sarah and Derek at the time they were killed, and is believed to have had a friendly relationship with them. It was DNA that finally led to Pratt's arrest. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department received a grant from the Bureau of Justice Administration, which allowed them to use new technology in the investigation. DNA was found on the pillow Sarah's body had been found resting on, but there was no match to the profile in criminal databases. Investigators then attempted to use forensic genetic genealogy in the case, looking in commercial DNA databases for relatives of the contributor of the DNA found at the crime scene. This effort did not identify a potential suspect. They then partnered with state police to use familial DNA technology. Instead of using commercial DNA sites, this technique involved searching the state criminal DNA database, looking for people who were related to the individual whose DNA was found on the pillow. This effort is what ultimately led to Pratt being identified as a potential suspect. Police then worked with the FBI to obtain a sample of Pratt's DNA, which proved to be a match to the DNA from the crime scene. According to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, this is the first time familial DNA has been used to solve a murder in the state of North Carolina. The technology was previously used in the state to make an arrest in a previously unsolved rape case, and to identify a John Doe in 2022. Pratt is currently being held at the Mecklenburg County Jail. After Pratt's arrest, Sarah's sister, Mary, said, "I'm so grateful the police have found this person, and I hope he spends the rest of his days behind bars." Wilhelmina Filkins, who went by Violet, came from a large family, growing up with 7 sisters and a brother. She never married or had children of her own, and in 1994, she was 81 years old and living alone in a ground-floor apartment in East Greenbush, New York. She retired after a long career with the State Department of Education, but remained active despite her age. Even though she did have a car, she made almost daily walks to a local convenience store, where the employees were fond of her, to buy grocery items. She loved to garden and volunteered often. She was a quiet woman who lived a simple life, attending Mass regularly and always keeping her weekly hair appointment. She was close with her family and friends, and her neighbors all liked her. Violet was last seen alive on Wednesday, August 17, 1994. 2 days later, on August 19th, her brother, Sterling, and her niece, Carol, went to her apartment to check on her. They realized that something was amiss. Before they even reached the apartment, they noticed that the curtains were caught in the apartment's sliding glass door, which meant the door could not be locked, as Violet normally kept it. When they opened the door, they discovered Violet's body lying close to it. Violet had been beaten severely about the head. A 1989 Plymouth Reliant was located at the apartment complex, but was not found in the manner Violet usually parked. Police believe that Violet was killed during a daytime robbery, and that her killer had used her vehicle to transport items stolen from her home before returning it to her apartment complex. Her killer did not appear to profit very much from the robbery and murder, as it is believed he disposed of many of the stolen items right after killing Violet. The items were found abandoned behind a local cemetery. 3 years after Violet was killed, an arrest was not immediately made. Despite the best efforts of investigators in the following years, the case was investigated by numerous law enforcement agencies, including the State Police Troop G Major Crimes Unit, the Bureau of Criminal Investigations Unit at the State Police Barracks, and the East Greenbush Police Department. However, it would be more than 28 years before the case was finally closed. On January 19, 2023, police announced that they had identified the man they believed killed Violet. His name was Jeremiah Gayette, and he had been 18 years old at the time of the murder. He had been living in the same apartment complex as Violet when she was killed, in a unit he shared with his father, just around the corner from where Violet lived. He had been interviewed about the case in 1994 when police canvassed the neighborhood, but was not considered a suspect at the time. He went on to serve in the Air Force and live in Florida, before returning to upstate New York, where he worked as a bus driver transporting both children and the elderly. Unfortunately, Gayette could not be prosecuted for Violet's murder. Investigators had identified him as a potential suspect in 2019. They went to see him on October 1st of that year. When they told him they wanted to speak with him about an incident that had taken place 25 years earlier, he immediately became visibly upset. He told the investigators that he would not speak to them without an attorney present, and they left the next day. Police came to the home after receiving a report of a shot being fired there. Gayette had shot himself in the head. He did not survive. A relative later told police that Gayette had called them after investigators came to see him and stated that he did not want to go to prison. Gayette had been brought to investigators' attention by one of his ex-girlfriends in 2009. He made statements to her while crying like, "That poor old woman. I robbed her. I hit her. And I just left her there." She did not think anything of these statements until 2019, when she was watching programming about cold cases on Netflix. She did some research and found out that an old woman, Violet, had been robbed and killed while Gayette had been living near her. She then went to the authorities with this information. DNA and fingerprints were taken during his autopsy, but due to a backlog of cases at the lab and the pandemic, it was years before they were analyzed. When the evidence was finally examined, Gayette's left thumbprint was matched to a print taken from Violet's coffee table. According to police, at the time of the murder, Gayette had plans to steal a car and rob a bank in order to pay for college. Violet's family is grateful to finally have the answers they feared they might never receive. Flight 185 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, on December 19, 1997, for what was supposed to be an 80-minute flight to Singapore. Piloting the flight were Captain Sui Wei Ming, 41, and First Officer Duncan Ward, 23. The first half hour of the flight was uneventful. The weather was calm, and the communications between the pilots and air traffic controllers were normal. However, the flight quickly became anything but routine. 35 minutes after takeoff, Flight 185 abruptly banked sharply to the right and began rapidly descending from its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The plane crashed into the Musi River in Sumatra, approximately halfway between Jakarta and Singapore. Less than a minute later, locals who witnessed the crash jumped into boats to try to find survivors in the water, but found only small pieces of debris. When Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, the NTSC, arrived on the scene, they had similar results. They officially confirmed the grim truth that all 104 people on board the flight, 97 passengers and 7 crew members, had perished. Because the Boeing 737 was made in the United States by an American company, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, became involved in the investigation. The NTSB had extensive experience in both 737 crash investigations and underwater salvaging, the latter of which proved especially beneficial. The waters of the Musi River are very murky, thanks to the deep layers of clay and mud that make up its riverbed. The poor visibility and enveloping riverbed made recovering what remained of the plane almost impossible. Investigators would eventually determine that in the final seconds before Silk Air 185 crashed, it had been traveling faster than the speed of sound. This great power behind the impact forced pieces of debris as far as 15 feet into the thick mud. This created the first major problem facing the investigation: the lack of a debris field. Normally, air crash investigators look at the pattern in which the debris is scattered in order to determine the state the plane was in upon impact, and if any pieces had come loose from the main fuselage before impact. For example, investigators can tell that a plane disintegrated on impact if its debris field is relatively small and contained. If a plane had broken apart in the air, its debris field will be spread out over a larger area. Even in cases where a plane has crashed in water, investigators usually can map out a debris field based on components of the plane that floated, like seat cushions. The mud and clay at the bottom of the river were so thick that they held down most of even these buoyant objects. This caused a great delay in the mapping of the crash site, which would normally be available to investigators very early on in the investigation. As with any investigation, the most important items to recover from the crash site were the two so-called black boxes: the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and the flight data recorder, FDR. The CVR records all noises made inside the cockpit, allowing investigators to hear not only what the pilots were saying during the flight and the eventual crash, but also how many and what kind of alarms may have been going off before impact. The FDR provides more technical data about how the plane and all of its systems had been functioning. Humongous cranes were brought in to dredge the bottom of the river for debris and hopefully locate the two recorders. Understanding the exact nature of Flight 185's sudden dive was of vital importance in determining what component of the plane had potentially failed. Even without the evidence from the FDR, investigators used Indonesian air traffic control data to track Flight 185's flight path and calculate the plane's speed. Planes no longer appear on radar returns when they go below 20,000 feet above ground. As such, investigators only had Flight 185's descent from 35,000 feet to 20,000 feet to examine. Even with this narrowed window, Flight 185's rate of descent was calculated as approximately 30,000 feet per minute. Terrifyingly, the maximum rate of descent for a 737 is normally 7,000 feet per minute. This gross anomaly provided the first major break in the investigation, but also served as a grave reminder of just how terrifying the final seconds on board the plane must have been for the passengers and crew. The first major pieces of the plane to be recovered were actually found outside of the massive search area in the river. About 2.5 miles east of the crash site, deep in the Sumatran rainforest, investigators found the horizontal stabilizer from Flight 185. Horizontal stabilizers are used to control the pitch of an airplane and are found in its back tail section. The distance from which the horizontal stabilizer fell from the rest of the plane indicated that it came off during the flight. Flight 185 had been flying during good weather, and there were no obvious conditions that would have minimized the pilot's visibility. The investigators' initial theory of the crash was that there had been some sort of catastrophic mechanical failure on the plane. This theory made discovering the cause of the crash of Flight 185 of utmost importance. In 1997, The Boeing 737 was one of the most widely flown commercial airliners in the world. 5 new 737s came into service every month. Flight 185 had, in fact, been Silkair's newest 737, having only been in service for 10 months. If a mechanical flaw inherent in the design of the 737 caused the crash of Flight 185, thousands of lives around the world were in danger every single day. These fears about the safety of the Boeing 737 received added merit from the model's troubled past. The 737 had been involved in several incidents of rudder hard-over. Hard-over occurs when a plane's rudder, which controls the direction in which the plane's nose is turned, becomes jammed to one side and cannot be controlled by the pilot. By the time of the Silkair crash, the NTSB had officially attributed the crashes of 2 737s, resulting in the combined loss of 157 lives, to rudder hard-over, and suspected that it played a part in at least 2 other incidents, which thankfully did not result in any loss of life. The separation of the tail section of Flight 185 would have been consistent with an occurrence of rudder hard-over. This possibility raised serious alarm bells for investigators. Boeing had engineered a fix for this problem before the construction of the plane that would eventually serve as Silkair Flight 185. Even if this crash had been caused by rudder hard-over, then the perceived fix for the problem was, in fact, no fix at all, and thousands of modified 737s were still prone to rudder hard-over. As a result, closely inspecting Flight 185's Power Control Unit, PCU, the piece of the plane that Boeing had modified to correct the 737's rudder hard-over problem, became vital to the investigation. Fortunately, the PCU was one of the pieces of the plane that could be recovered from the crash site. The PCU as a whole and the servo valve within it, which had failed in 2 previous fatal 737 crashes, were available for examination. They were inspected for corrosion, but none was found. Everyone who examined the component found it to be in working order, and rudder hard-over was ruled out as a cause of the crash. Investigators now attributed the plane's tail ripping off the back of the plane to its rapid and violent descent, and not to a mechanical failure in the tail itself. While this was good news for Boeing and for 737 passengers around the globe, it left the team working on the Flight 185 case still without an explanation for the crash. On the 5th day of the investigation, Christmas Eve of 1997, investigators somewhat miraculously located the flight data recorder of Flight 185. In an even more seemingly impossible stroke of luck, the cockpit voice recorder was found in the new year, on the very last day the river was being searched. It was buried under 27 feet of mud. Both black boxes appeared to be in usable condition. However, because Indonesia did not have a laboratory capable of analyzing the data on them, the recorders had to be sent to NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C., creating another delay in the investigation. When the data from the recorders was finally analyzed 3 weeks after the crash, it raised more questions than it answered. The FDR had somehow stopped recording while the plane was still in the air. Data was available for the first 34 minutes and 14 seconds of the flight, and it all fell within the expected ranges. After that, there was no data whatsoever. Since the recorder cut off roughly a minute before Flight 185's sudden descent, investigators could not blame the dive for the stopping of the recording. Whatever caused the tape to cut off happened before whatever caused the plane to crash. This left the investigative team with one more question. It needed the recordings from the CVR to solve. Furthermore, with the loss of the final minutes of FDR data, the CVR was the only means investigators had of gaining insight into the last moments the plane was in the air and what was happening on board Flight 185 during its final terrifying descent. This loss of information posed a major problem for investigators, but the absence of the recordings itself would become a major clue in piecing together the final minutes of the flight. Unfortunately, the CVR data was just as puzzling as the FDR data. The first 34 minutes of the recording contained nothing but normal communications, such as the captain's welcome to the passengers over the intercom, and the standard checks the captain and the first officer would have gone over together. Neither pilot made any mention of anything unusual happening. Then, like the FDR, the CVR abruptly stopped recording. This was puzzling enough on its own, but the CVR also stopped recording almost 6 minutes before the FDR did, meaning there had most likely been 2 different causes for the 2 devices ceasing their recording. Because they are built to withstand a plane crash, black boxes are designed to be very durable and dependable. Any kind of power failure that would cause them to stop recording is exceptionally uncommon. There was also no indication that there had been anything wrong with the plane's electrical system, and such a flaw would not have explained the delay between the two units failing, as they were on two different circuits. The odds that both units would independently fail, much less right before the plane crashed, were almost too minute to be considered. Investigators began experimenting in a test plane to see if some sort of overload could have shorted the circuit and what effects it would have had on the devices. They discovered that it was possible to overload the circuit, but they also discovered that doing so resulted in a loud sound as the breaker popped. The sound was the last noise on the recording from the CVR on the test plane. However, the sound could not be heard on Flight 185's CVR. With the investigators' possible causes for the failure of the boxes becoming increasingly more limited and simultaneously more disturbing, they ran one more scenario in the test plane: pulling the circuit manually. Doing so did not cause any noise on the recording. Having ruled out a physical cause for the failure of Flight 185's black boxes, investigators began looking into the unsettling reason why someone in the cockpit would disable the recorders. Lacking data about the plane's performance during its final minutes of flight from the FDR, investigators turned back to alternative sources of information. The radar data was used in a series of test flights in a simulator to determine what exact set of circumstances would result in Flight 185's descent from 35,000 feet to 20,000 feet on the specific path shown by the radar returns. They tested over 20 different scenarios, including various mechanical failures, trying to match the path taken by Flight 185. None of the scenarios, including the initially suspected rudder hard over, built within the parameters in the radar return data. The only way to get the simulated 737 to drop as steeply and as quickly as Flight 185 did was by having the pilot accelerate and continuously bank the plane sharply to the right. The only explanation for the accident was that it wasn't an accident, but an intentional maneuver made by one of the two pilots. Before going public with such a horrifying theory, investigators began looking for physical evidence to support their version of events. The key piece in confirming that the plane had been in a commanded dive was its jack screw. A jack screw is a part located in the horizontal stabilizer of a plane that rotates when pilots push a switch on their control column. This turning moves the horizontal stabilizer up and down, changing the pitch of the plane. The NTSB was able to calculate the final pitch angle of the stabilizer based on the last setting of the recovered jack screw. The calculations confirmed that the horizontal stabilizer had not been in the expected cruising position. It had instead been in the nose-down position. The logical but horrible conclusion was that one of Flight 185's pilots intentionally crashed the plane into the river. According to the CVR, First Officer Duncan Ward had been alone in the cockpit shortly before the crash. Captain Sui Ming is heard asking his first officer if he would like some water, and telling him that he is heading back into the cabin. The last sound the CVR captured was, rather than the popping noise of the CVR circuit as investigators had been looking for earlier, the sound of the captain's harness buckle clanging against the bottom of his chair as he stood up to leave the cockpit. Indonesian flight traffic controllers confirmed that it was Ward they spoke to when they checked in 2 minutes before the plane began its fatal dive. However, with these final minutes unaccounted for by the CVR, investigators still had to work to determine who had been at the controls of the plane at the time of the crash. At this point, the investigation turned mainly towards the two pilots and their personal lives, trying to discern any reason as to why either of them would kill not only themselves, but also 103 other people. Interviews with Silk Air staff showed that New Zealand-born First Officer Duncan Ward was generally well-liked and easy to work with. He had no debts, no troubled romantic relationships, and no history of any sort of mental illness. Initially, there was some suspicion that the pressures of living and working so far away from his home country and his entire family may have caused psychological problems for Ward, but his family members insisted that this was not the case. According to them, Duncan had loved flying since he was a teenager and considered himself very lucky to have the opportunity to make it his career, on paper. Captain Sui Ming similarly seemed to have plenty to live for and no motive to sabotage the flight. He was married and the father of 3 young boys. As a former Air Force pilot, he had risen through the ranks at Silk Air quickly. However, interviews with other pilots revealed that Captain Sue had a reputation for often being willing to cut corners and take chances in order to decrease his flight times. 6 months before his death, he had been investigated by the airline because of a sharp landing he had made at an unsafe speed. The landing had been so violent that many of the passengers on board had gotten sick because of it. Captain Sue had been demoted from an instructor captain to a regular captain as a result of the investigation. Looking further back into Captain Sue's history as a pilot revealed a troubling coincidence. Silk Air Flight 185 had crashed on December 19, 1997. On December 19, 1979, Sui Ming, then an Air Force pilot, took off for a training mission with 3 other fighter pilots. A mechanical problem with his jet caused him to have to turn around and return to base. During the course of the mission, his 3 squadron mates continued on without him. All 3 died when their planes hit a mountain obstructed from their view by clouds. At least 2 of the other pilots were believed to have been close friends of Captain Sue. Such a heavy loss, and a potential case of survivor's guilt, would have potentially made the date of December 19 highly emotionally charged for the captain. Sui Wei-ming's finances also turned out to be a source of pressure at the time of the crash. He had lost over $1 million in the past 4 years through high-risk online securities exchanging. He had so many outstanding debts that his trading privileges in the Singapore stock market had been suspended. At the time of the crash, on the morning of the flight, he had pledged to repay his large debts as soon as he returned to Singapore. Investigators suddenly had a mountain of motives for Captain Sue to want to not only end his life, but also to damage the reputation of Silk Air. However, just because Captain Sue had a motive to crash the plane did not mean he actually did. The last known person to be in the cockpit before the crash was First Officer Ward. Furthermore, he had been alone, which would have given him the opportunity to crash the plane. However, these circumstances in fact seemed to exonerate him from suspicion. The circuit for the cockpit voice recorder is on the captain's side of the cockpit in a 737. When Captain Sue left the cockpit, his hand would have been within inches of it. He could have easily pulled the circuit to stop the CVR from recording without his first officer noticing. If First Officer Ward had been the one to pull the circuit, the CVR would have recorded the sounds of him unbuckling his harness and getting up to go over to where he could reach it. As such, it is most likely that Captain Sue pulled the circuit as he left the cockpit, as heard at the end of the CVR's recording. It is hard to imagine why the captain would want the CVR to stop recording, unless he planned to do something that he would not want there to be a record of, like crash the plane. It is impossible to know exactly what happened in the final minutes of Flight 185. However, the circumstantial evidence leads investigators to believe that after First Officer Ward completed his last radio call, Captain Sue re-entered the cockpit. He made up a reason to send First Officer Ward into the cabin. Maybe he told him a flight attendant asked to see him, or perhaps he ordered him to take a final break before they needed to plan for landing. After the first officer left, Captain Sue would have locked the door, pulling the circuit to the FDR. Unlike the CVR, this causes a loud master alarm. Captain Sue, by disarming the CVR, had shown that he was actively trying to prevent there being any record of what he planned to do. As such, he would have had to disarm the FDR as well. He would have had to lock the door to prevent First Officer Ward from rushing back into the cockpit and potentially stopping him from crashing the plane. When he heard the loud alarm, Captain Sue would have had to use all of his strength to push on the control column enough to cause the sharp descent recorded by the radar data. He would not have been able to accomplish it while fighting off his first officer. Without the CVR, it is impossible to know if Ward tried to re-enter the cockpit to help when he heard the alarm, or if he had realized what was going on when he found the door to be locked. Since Captain Sue sent the plane into its final dive less than a minute after disarming the FDR, it is possible that Ward did not even have a chance to make it back to the door and try to re-enter the cockpit. It is probable, however, that First Officer Ward was standing at the time, being unsecured by a seat belt or a harness. He would have likely been slammed into the ceiling of the cabin when the plane began its sharp bank. First Officer Ward could very well have been deceased or unconscious within seconds of the beginning of the plane's descent, unable to do anything to try to prevent it. Indonesia's NTSC released its report about Flight 185 3 years after the crash. Shockingly, the formal report disregarded the evidence presented by investigators and announced that no cause of the crash was discovered. The report claimed that there was insufficient evidence to determine a cause for the accident, because the final minutes of the flight were not recorded. The NTSB publicly contradicted this report by issuing one of their own. The NTSB report cited a deliberate act on the part of Sui Wei Ming as the cause of the crash, and detailed the evidence with which that determination was reached, challenging both the notion that the cause of the accident was unknown and that there was insufficient evidence to reach a conclusion about what had transpired to bring down the plane. There are obvious biases that could be influencing these differing opinions. The NTSC publicly blaming a pilot flying out of their country's main airport for bringing down a plane could have potentially damaged customer confidence in commercial air travel. The airport Flight 185 had taken off from service to over 18 million passengers a year at the time of the crash. The NTSC had an obvious motive to try to protect the large and rapidly expanding Indonesian air travel industry. Similarly, the NTSB had motive to protect Boeing, the makers of the 737, from civil lawsuits and the loss of its strong reputation. Allegations that the NTSB report was fabricated to protect the company persist to this day. Boeing was, and still is, one of the largest manufacturers of commercial airliners in the world, and also had and has large aerospace and defense operations, including numerous contracts with the United States government. In 1997, the year of the Flight 185 crash, Boeing employed almost 250,000 people and generated almost $46 billion in revenue. The company had weathered the crisis of the two U.S. 737 crashes because it had corrected the problem with the model servo valve. Once it was discovered, if Boeing had incorrectly addressed this problem, the impact on its reputation, and therefore its sales, could have been catastrophic. Since that could lead to the loss of thousands of American jobs, it could have severely damaged the U.S. economy. The NTSB could have been biased against blaming the crash on a mechanical failure. Both agencies had serious economic and governmental pressures on the results they reported. Despite the conflicting reports issued by their government agencies, both American and Indonesian members of the team that actually investigated the crash take the available evidence to mean that Flight 185 was brought down by an intentional command, most likely by Captain Sui Ming. Furthermore, the NTSB report was authored by Greg Fife, who had been directly involved with the investigation and had personally dealt with the evidence. The NTSC report, on the other hand, had been released by the head of the committee, who would have been more aware of and concerned with the political and economic consequences of the committee's ruling. In addition to the two conflicting conclusions about the cause of the crash presented by the two government agencies that were in charge of the investigation, blame was assigned to another party in 2004. A jury in a Los Angeles Superior Court concluded that the servo valve and the PCU was what brought down the plane. They ordered Parker Hannifin, the manufacturer of the PCU, to pay the three families who had brought the suit $43.6 million. The servo valve had been suspected early in the investigation into the crash of Flight 185 because problems with it had resulted in two previous 737 crashes. The NTSC, the TSB, and Parker Hannifin had all examined the servo valve and surrounding PCU, and found it to be in working order. Inspection of the rudder also showed no signs of rudder hard over, the condition the failure of the servo valve would have caused. The evidence collected by the NTSB and the report it issued evaluating it were not allowed into evidence in the Los Angeles case. As such, jurors did not hear about the conclusion that Flight 185 was brought down intentionally, nor did they have access to the majority of the evidence available about Flight 185, because it was collected as part of the official investigation. Lacking the majority of the information about Flight 185's crash, the main source of information in the trial was testimony from a metals expert hired as part of a private investigation for the lawsuit. The expert presented photographs from a scanning electron microscope showing chips in the servo valve of the PCU recovered from Flight 185. This expert also testified that these microscopic chips could have interfered with the operation of the plane's rudder, leading to rudder hard over and the crash. However, it is impossible to know if these microscopic flaws would have someday led to the crash of this particular 737. It is also hard to determine if these chips were present before the violent crash, or were a result of it. Parker Hannifin initially announced that it would appeal the Los Angeles verdict. However, they eventually decided to settle out of court and pay an unspecified amount of money to each family involved in the crash. They did not, however, ever accept any liability for the crash of Flight 185. In addition to the settlement from Parker Hannifin, each victim's family received $100,000 from Silk Air and an undisclosed amount of compensation from Boeing. Because the NTSC report did not implicate Sui Wei Ming in the crash, his family received the entirety of his death benefits. The cause of the crash of Silk Air 185 will probably always be a source of controversy. However, the evidence collected during the investigation most comprehensively points to the loss of the plane and all those on board as being a result of Captain Sui Ming intentionally piloting the plane into the Musi River. While the NTSB's evidence for its version of events is circumstantial, it is overwhelming. In 1994, Tanya Frazier lived in the Mount Baker neighborhood in southeast Seattle with her mother and sister. The 14-year-old tomboy was sweet and generous, always bringing joy to those around her. Despite her slightly shy disposition, she was an altar server at St. Clement's Episcopal Church and spent the day of July 17th at a church picnic. She participated in potato sack races and told fellow parishioners about her new haircut. The following day, Monday, July 18, 1994, Tanya had summer classes at Meany Middle School in the morning. She was last seen leaving the school around 11 a.m. As expected, she was then supposed to take the bus to get to her part-time job at a thrift store on Jackson Street run by the Chicken Soup Brigade, a local nonprofit. Tanya did not arrive home at 6 p.m. as expected, so her mother Teresa went to the thrift store to look for her. She learned that Tanya had never arrived for her scheduled shift. Teresa then went to Meany Middle School to look for Tanya, but there was no sign of her there. Teresa contacted the police to report Tanya missing around 7:30 p.m. Police did not seem to view Tanya's disappearance as an urgent matter. They repeatedly tried to get her younger sister to say that Tanya had plans to run away from home and referred to Tanya as a runaway throughout their initial report. This was an important distinction because while a missing child would have a detective assigned to their case, a runaway would only be assigned a community service officer. An officer spoke to two of Tanya's friends and called Teresa a few days later to ask if she had heard from Tanya. Tanya's mother did not believe her daughter had run away, both because it would have been out of character for her and because of practical considerations. If Tanya had left on her own accord, she had done so without any of her belongings or any money. At the time she disappeared, Tanya was excitedly waiting for her first paycheck from her part-time job, which she was due to receive in just a few days. She planned to use the money to buy pagers for herself and for her 12-year-old sister Tyra. Tyra herself was another reason why no one who knew Tanya believed she had run away. Tyra and Tanya were very close and were described as soul mates. Tanya would almost certainly never have gone anywhere without Tyra and would have at least talked to her if she had any plans to leave. Tyra spent the night after Tanya disappeared with her bedroom window open just in case Tanya came home. While she could not imagine Tanya running away, the idea of something bad happening to Tanya was even more difficult to fathom. Tanya's church quickly came together to organize on Tanya's behalf when she disappeared. Corporate policies prevented them from posting flyers in many stores, but they still covered the area in over 1,500 missing persons posters. The police have a hell of a task. I want to be supportive of that, Father Ralph Garcadden, Tanya's pastor, told the media. But I also feel that had Tanya not come from our neighborhood or not been mixed race, would more people have known this terrible thing had happened to her. On July 23, 1994, 5 days after Tanya went missing, a 62-year-old man was walking his dog along East Highland Drive when he noticed the smell of death. He had become familiar with that smell during his time serving during the Korean War. He stepped into a wooded area along the street and saw someone lying at the base of a tree at the bottom of a ravine. He stared at the person for several seconds before he fully processed the fact that he was looking at a human body. The body belonged to Tanya Frazier, who had been stabbed to death. The medical examiner believed she had not been killed until July 20th, 2 days after her disappearance. This caused fear in Tanya's mother Teresa that the police initially dismissing her daughter as a runaway may have resulted in her death. From the first report, I often wondered if they took it as more serious. If they looked in that first 24 hours, would there have been a chance she maybe would have been saved? That's a big question, she later told the Seattle Times. Tanya's community came together to mourn her loss. A memorial was established near where her body was found, and members of her church took to the streets for walks of remembrance. It was a member of her church who donated the cemetery plot where Tanya would be buried. Tanya had a routine of picking out one of her stuffed animals to take with her on her walk to school every day. Other students now took up this habit. Tanya was last seen alive at 21st Avenue and East Thomas Street, approximately 11 blocks away from where her body would later be found. Her friends reported seeing her speaking to an unfamiliar, unkempt man. This man has so far never been identified, despite the best efforts of her loved ones. Tanya's case received little media attention. Talking about her daughter's murder was unbearable for Teresa, but she tried to find any opportunity to do so that she could in order to keep the case in the news and hopefully reach a witness who could help solve the case. Flyers posted by Crime Stoppers generated just 3 calls to the tip line, none of which helped advance the investigation. Private investigator Rose Winquist began working with Tanya's family the week she went missing. She continues to work on the case and forwards every credible lead she finds to the police. Seattle Police Detective Ralph Norton, who has been the lead investigator on Tanya's case since June of 2016, says that there are numerous persons of interest in the case, none of whom will be cleared until the case is definitively solved. Despite the fact that almost 30 years have passed since Tanya's murder, her sister Tyra is still hoping that one day the case will be solved. "I am hopeful. I can't imagine this just never being solved and never having that closure, so I'm hopeful that it will be," she said in 2023.